Tonight on Gay Timeline, we are turning back the clock to 1862 in the middle of the American Civil War. The air smells like gunpowder and unwashed wool, and 500,000 young men are sleeping shoulder to shoulder in canvas tents that leak when it rains. They had no word for what they were, but they had each other. And tonight, we say their names out loud, because they could not. I am Julian. This is Gay Timeline. In the summer of 1862, in a Union Army camp outside Richmond, Virginia, a 23-year-old private named Jerome Robbins was lying in a tent next to a man he loved. The man's name was George Crehor. They were both Massachusetts volunteers, both clerks before the war, both sleeping under the same government-issue blanket because the army had not given them enough. Jerome's hand was resting on George's chest. George's breath was warm against Jerome's neck. And in the morning, they would wake up and march 12 miles in the heat, and no one, not their captain, not their sergeant, not the exhausted boys from Pennsylvania sleeping 3 feet away, thought anything was wrong with it. To understand why no one cared, you have to understand something the Civil War believed about male intimacy that most history books refuse to explain. But first, a few quick things before we settle in. If you find yourself drawn into this story, the like and subscribe buttons are there for you. But only if this is genuinely your kind of evening. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, let us go back to Virginia. For most of history, these men were alone. They wrote letters no one would read. They loved in rooms no one would visit. Tonight, we keep them company. That is all sleep needs to be, a quiet act of refusing to let someone be forgotten. By the end of tonight, you will know why 2 Union soldiers could share a bed without suspicion, why a Confederate officer was court-martialed for the wrong kind of touch, and what was really written in the diaries that the soldiers' families burned after the war. Jerome Robbins kept a diary, so did George Crehor. Both diaries survived. Both are now held in the Massachusetts Historical Society, in acid-free boxes, in a climate-controlled room, because someone 100 years later decided these particular pieces of paper mattered. Jerome's handwriting is small and cramped, the ink faded to brown. George's is looser, more confident, with flourishes on the capital letters. And if you sit down and read them side by side, you start to notice something. They are writing to each other. Not literally. These are private diaries, meant for no one's eyes. But Jerome records a joke George told on Tuesday. George records a dream Jerome had on Wednesday. Jerome writes that he misses George when George is on picket duty. George writes that the tent feels empty without Jerome. And on the night of August 7th, 1862, Jerome writes this, word for word, "Slept with George again. I am more content than I have been in months. I do not know what I would do without him." The next morning, they woke up and went to war. The American Civil War killed more than 600,000 men. That is more than all other American wars combined, up to that point. It was a war fought brother against brother, state against state. And if you have ever sat through a high school history class, you know the story. Slavery, secession, Gettysburg, Lincoln, the Emancipation Proclamation, and then everyone goes home and Reconstruction happens and we all feel bad about it. But here is what they do not tell you in high school. The Civil War was the gayest war America ever fought, not because the soldiers were more likely to be gay than soldiers in any other war, but because the conditions of the war, the closeness, the intimacy, the sheer physical and emotional dependence men had on each other, created a space where same-sex love could exist in plain sight, without suspicion, without shame, and sometimes without even a name. Let me show you what I mean. In 1862, if you were a young man in the Union Army, you did not sleep alone. You could not. There were not enough tents, not enough blankets, not enough of anything. The Union Army was a logistical nightmare, undersupplied and overwhelmed, and the solution to most problems was to shove men closer together and hope for the best. So you slept two to a bedroll. You shared a tent with 3 other men. You marched in tight formation, elbow to elbow, close enough to smell the onions your bunkmate ate for breakfast. You bathed together in rivers. You mended each other's uniforms. You wrote letters home for the men who could not write. You held the hands of boys who were dying and told them it would be all right, even when you knew it would not. And if you loved another man, if you felt something more than camaraderie, something deeper than friendship, you could live that love openly, as long as you never called it by name. Because the word homosexual did not exist yet. It would not be invented for another 7 years. The concept of a gay identity, a fixed, innate orientation that defined who you were, did not exist in 1862. There was no closet because there was no door. What there was instead was behavior. And the behavior that mattered, the only behavior that could get you in trouble, was very specific. Sodomy. The Union Army's Articles of War, written in 1806, and still in effect during the Civil War, had exactly one rule about sex between men. Article 83. It read, in full, "Any officer or soldier who shall be convicted of sodomy shall suffer death, or such other punishment as a court-martial may direct." That is it. No definition of sodomy. No clarification of what counted. No mention of desire, or attraction, or love. Just the act. And even then, the rule was almost never enforced. In the entire Civil War, across 4 years and more than 2 million soldiers, there are exactly 3 documented courts-martial for sodomy in the Union Army. 3 out of 2 million men. One of those cases involved an officer who sexually assaulted an enlisted man. He was dishonorably discharged. One involved a private who propositioned another soldier in explicit terms and was overheard by a chaplain. He was sentenced to hard labor and released after 6 months. And one involved a case so poorly documented that historians are not even sure what happened, except that someone was accused, someone was acquitted, and everyone went back to the war. The Confederate Army's record is even thinner. There are no surviving courts-martial for sodomy in the Confederate military. None. Either it never happened, or no one wrote it down, or the records burned with Atlanta. So what does that tell you? It tells you that the Civil War did not care if you loved another man. It cared if you penetrated him. And if you were careful, if you were quiet, if you kept your intimacy to the socially acceptable script of romantic friendship, you could love as openly as you wanted. Romantic friendship. That is the term historians use now to describe the relationships between men in the 19th century that looked to modern eyes exactly like love. Men who wrote each other passionate letters. Men who slept in the same bed for years. Men who called each other pet names, who wept when separated, who described their bond as the most important relationship of their lives. And the key thing, the thing that makes this era so alien and so heartbreaking, is that no one thought it was strange. Because men in the 19th century were expected to have deep emotional bonds with each other. Romantic friendship was not a suspicious category, it was an ideal. The Victorian era loved the idea of 2 men bound by noble affection, loyalty, and shared suffering. It was classical, it was Homeric, it was Achilles and Patroclus, minus the part where they definitely had sex. So when Jerome Robbins wrote that he slept with George Crehore and felt content, he was not confessing anything dangerous. He was describing a normal, admirable, perfectly respectable bond between soldiers. The fact that he might have also been in love with George, the fact that his contentment might have included desire, longing, physical intimacy, was invisible to everyone who was not Jerome. Because the Victorians had decided, collectively and conveniently, that men simply did not feel that way about each other. Male intimacy was pure, spiritual, platonic. And if 2 men happened to share a bedroll every night for 3 years, well, that just meant they were very good friends. Let me give you an example of how far this could go. There was a Confederate soldier named William Nugent. He fought for Mississippi. He was married. He had a wife back home named Eleanor, and he wrote her letters every week, dutiful and affectionate. But he also had a tent mate named Alfred, and in 1863, William wrote a letter to Eleanor that included this line: "Alfred and I are as close as man and wife." He wrote that to his actual wife, and then he continued, "We share everything. We sleep together, we eat together, we talk late into the night. I do not know how I will bear it when the war ends and we are separated." Eleanor wrote back. Her response has survived. She said she was glad William had someone to take care of him. No suspicion, no jealousy, no concern. Because in 1863, the idea that William might be in love with Alfred in the same way he was supposed to be in love with Eleanor was simply not on the table. Men could be as intimate as they wanted, as long as no one said the word sodomy out loud. And so they were. Let me take you deeper into Jerome and George's story, because their diaries are the most detailed record we have of what a romantic friendship looked like from the inside, in real time, during the war. Jerome Robbins was from Williamstown, Massachusetts. He was the son of a minister. He had taught school for 2 years before the war, and he enlisted in the 37th Massachusetts Infantry in September of 1861, 3 months after Fort Sumter. He was skinny, nearsighted, not particularly strong. His captain described him as literate and sincere, but not suited for combat. Jerome did not care. He wanted to be part of something larger than himself. He wanted to prove he was brave. George Crehore was from Dorchester. He was a clerk in a shipping office. He was 2 years older than Jerome, broader in the shoulders, steadier in temperament. He enlisted the same week Jerome did, and they met on the train to Washington. By the time they reached the capital, they had decided to request the same tent assignment. For the next 2 years, they were inseparable. Their diaries record everything: the boredom of camp life, the fear before battle, the smell of gunpowder and blood, the taste of hardtack, which Jerome described as a cracker designed by someone who hates the human jaw, the cold of winter quarters, the heat of summer marches, and woven through all of it, constantly, is each other. Jerome writes about the way George laughs. George writes about the way Jerome reads poetry out loud in the tent at night. Jerome writes that he feels safest when George is nearby. George writes that he cannot imagine the war without Jerome. And then, in the winter of 1863, when the 37th Massachusetts is stuck in camp near Fredericksburg, freezing and underfed and waiting for spring, Jerome writes this: "Last night, George and I lay awake talking until nearly dawn. We spoke of what we will do when the war is over. He wants to move west. I want to return to teaching. But we both agreed we cannot imagine a future in which we are not together. He held my hand in the dark and told me I was the best part of his life. I told him the same. I do not have the words for what I feel, only that I would rather die here with him than live a long life without him." 2 weeks later, George wrote this: "Jerome is ill, a fever. The surgeon says it is not serious, but I am afraid. I have seen too many men die of fevers that were not serious. I sat with him all day. He was shivering, so I lay down beside him and held him until he slept. If he dies, I do not know what I will do. He is everything to me." Jerome did not die. He recovered. And in March, the 37th Massachusetts was ordered to move south, toward Richmond, and Jerome and George packed up their tent and their diaries and kept writing. They were not the only ones. All over the Civil War, men were writing letters and diaries that sound, to modern ears, like love letters. And they were. But they were also acceptable, because the language of romantic friendship gave men permission to express feelings that would have been suspicious in any other context. Let me show you a few examples. A Union soldier named James Garfield, yes, the future president, wrote letters to a friend named Harry Rhodes that included lines like this: "I sleep better when I imagine you are near. I miss you more than I can say. Yours forever." A Confederate officer named Josiah Gorgas wrote to a fellow officer, "I find myself thinking of you at odd hours. The thought of you is a comfort." A private named Samuel Cormany wrote in his diary, "My messmate and I are devoted to each other. He is dearer to me than any friend I have known." None of these men were court-martialed. None of them were suspected of anything, because they were using the approved script: devotion, affection, loyalty, noble friendship. As long as you stayed within that language, you were safe. But if you stepped outside it, if you made your desire explicit, if you propositioned another man in clear sexual terms, if you got caught in the act of sodomy, then the script collapsed and you were in danger. Which brings me to the only detailed sodomy court-martial from the Union Army that has survived in full. His name was Lieutenant Charles Hawkins. He was an officer in the 2nd New York Cavalry. And in the fall of 1862, he was caught in a tent with an enlisted man, both of them partially undressed, in what the court-martial record describes as an act of gross indecency. The trial transcript runs to 47 pages. It is held in the National Archives in Washington, in a box labeled Courts Martial 1862-1863, and it is one of the most detailed records we have of how the Union Army handled same-sex intimacy when it crossed the line from romantic friendship into something undeniable. The enlisted man's name was Private Samuel Whiting. He was 19. He testified that Lieutenant Hawkins had invited him to his tent to discuss a promotion. Once inside, Hawkins had locked the tent flap, poured 2 glasses of whiskey, and then, according to Whiting's testimony, placed his hand upon my person in a manner that was unmistakable in its intent. Whiting said he tried to leave. Hawkins blocked the exit. Whiting said he protested. Hawkins told him to be quiet. And then, this is where the transcript gets vague, because the court recorder was clearly uncomfortable. Something happened that involved both men removing their trousers. A corporal walking past the tent heard a struggle. He opened the flap. He saw both men. He reported it to the captain. Lieutenant Hawkins was arrested the next morning. The trial took 3 days. Hawkins did not deny that Private Whiting had been in his tent. He did not deny that they had been drinking. He did not deny that they were partially undressed. What he denied was intent. He claimed Whiting had come to him willingly. He claimed they were simply bathing, using a basin in the tent because the river was too cold. He claimed the corporal had misunderstood what he saw. The court did not believe him. Hawkins was found guilty of conduct unbecoming an officer and attempted sodomy. The sentence was dishonorable discharge and 6 months in military prison. He served 4 months. He was released in early 1863, and after that, the record goes silent. We do not know what happened to him. We do not know if he went home or west, or into another name. Private Whiting was not charged. He was transferred to another unit and survived the war. And here is the detail that makes this case so interesting. The trial transcript never uses the word homosexual. It never suggests that Hawkins was a certain kind of man. It describes his crime as an action, not an identity. The language is legal, specific, behavioral. He attempted sodomy, that is all. Because in 1862, you could not be gay. You could only do gay things. And if you did not do them, or if you did them quietly enough that no one could prove it, then you were just another soldier, sleeping close to another soldier, in a war where everyone slept close. Jerome and George understood this. Their diaries make it clear that they knew exactly how far they could go. They shared a bed. They held hands. They wrote about devotion and contentment and need, but they never wrote about sex. They never used language that would have made their relationship undeniable. And so, they survived. The summer of 1862 melted into fall. The 37th Massachusetts fought at Antietam in September, the bloodiest single day of the war, 23,000 casualties in 12 hours, and Jerome and George both survived. Jerome wrote that he stayed close to George during the battle, that knowing George was nearby kept him from running. George wrote that he saw Jerome take cover behind a stone wall and felt a relief so overwhelming he nearly wept. After Antietam, the regiment was pulled back to Maryland to rest and regroup. They spent October in camp, recovering. Jerome's diary from that month is full of small domestic details. He and George washed their uniforms in a creek. They played cards with 2 other soldiers from their company. They cooked a chicken they had stolen from a nearby farm and ate it with their fingers, greasy and laughing. Jerome wrote, "I have never been happier." By November, they were back on the march. The winter of 1862 was brutal. The 37th Massachusetts spent it in camp near Falmouth, Virginia, just across the Rappahannock River from Fredericksburg. The Army of the Potomac had just suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Fredericksburg in December. 12,000 Union casualties in a single afternoon. Wave after wave of men sent uphill into Confederate rifle fire for no strategic gain whatsoever. Jerome and George had both been held in reserve during the battle. They watched from across the river as their fellow soldiers were cut down. Jerome wrote that night, "I have never been so grateful to be a coward." They were not cowards. They were just lucky. Winter camp was its own kind of hell. Cold, wet, endless. The men built log huts with canvas roofs and packed the walls with mud to keep out the wind. It did not work. Jerome described waking up with frost on his blanket, inside the hut, in front of a fire that had burned all night. George described the taste of the coffee, which was not coffee at all, but roasted acorns ground into a brown powder that the army pretended was the real thing. They were hungry all the time. The supply lines were a mess, hardtack and salt pork, day after day, until your gums bled from scurvy and your stomach cramped from lack of vegetables. Men traded tobacco for apples. Men stole from farms. Men shot squirrels and roasted them over open fires and called it a feast. But Jerome and George had each other, and that made it bearable. Their diaries from that winter read like a dialogue. Jerome writes that George gave him half his ration of salt pork because Jerome had been sick. George writes that Jerome sat up with him all night when George had dysentery, holding a bucket and wiping his face with a wet cloth and never once complaining about the smell. Jerome writes, "I think I could endure anything as long as George is here." George writes, "Jerome is the only warmth in this frozen place." And no one thought it was strange, because all around them, other men were writing the same things. Let me introduce you to another pair. Their names were Constant Hanks and Orville Bumpus, both privates in the 20th Connecticut Infantry, both farm boys from outside Hartford, both 19 years old when they enlisted in the summer of 1862. Constant, and yes, that was his real name. His mother was extremely religious, kept a small leather-bound diary that is now held at the Connecticut State Library. Orville did not keep a diary, but he wrote letters home to his sister, and she saved every single one, and those letters are now part of the same archive. Constant and Orville were bunkmates. They shared a tent for 18 months, and Constant's diary is full of Orville. He records the songs Orville sang, the jokes Orville told, the way Orville slept with one arm flung over his head, the time Orville got drunk on Applejack and tried to fight a goat. In February of 1863, Constant wrote this, "Orville is my best friend in all the world. I would take a bullet for him. I pray every night that God keeps him safe, because I do not think I could bear this war without him." A month later, Orville wrote this in a letter to his sister. "You asked me if I have made any friends in the army. I have made one. His name is Constant. He is the finest man I know. We do everything together. I think when the war is over, I will ask him to come live with us on the farm. I cannot imagine going back to the old life and not having him nearby." In May of 1863, the 20th Connecticut was sent to Louisiana as part of the siege of Port Hudson. The siege lasted 48 days. It was a nightmare. Heat, disease, constant shelling. Men died of sunstroke and malaria and infected wounds. Constant Hanks died on June 19, 1863, a Confederate sharpshooter, single bullet to the chest. He was carried back to the Union lines and died an hour later in the field hospital. Orville Bumpus was with him when he died. We know this because Orwell wrote a letter to his sister 3 days later. The letter is 4 pages long, and most of it is illegible because the ink is smeared, because Orwell was crying when he wrote it. The parts that are legible say this: Constant is gone. I held his hand while he died. He could not speak, but he looked at me, and I think he knew I was there. I have never felt pain like this. It is as if part of me has been cut away. I do not know how to keep living without him. Orwell survived the war. He went home to Connecticut. He never married. He lived with his sister and her family for the rest of his life, and when he died in 1891, his sister wrote in her own diary that Orwell had asked to be buried with one item: a small leather-bound diary that had belonged to a friend from the war. Constance's diary was buried with Orwell. It stayed in the ground for 93 years, until the cemetery was relocated in 1984 and the graves were exhumed. Someone opened Orwell's coffin. They found the diary, still wrapped in oilcloth, still legible. That is how it ended up in the Connecticut State Library. That is how we know. The Civil War is full of stories like this. Men who loved each other. Men who died for each other. Men who survived and spent the rest of their lives grieving. And almost none of them ever called it love, because they did not have to. The word friendship was big enough to hold everything they felt, except when it was not. There were men who knew exactly what they were feeling, who knew it was not just friendship, who wanted more than the safe script of romantic devotion. And for those men, the war was a different kind of danger. Let me tell you about a Confederate soldier named Richard Hall. He was a lieutenant in the 4th Georgia Infantry. He was 26 when the war started. He had been a school teacher in Savannah. He was literate, well-read, kept a detailed diary that runs to more than 300 pages. And Richard Hall was in love with another officer named William Bradford. We know this because Richard wrote it down, not in coded language, not in the safe vocabulary of romantic friendship. He wrote it plainly, explicitly, in his diary, in entries that make it very clear he understood exactly what he was feeling and exactly how dangerous it was. In August of 1862, Richard wrote this: I am afflicted with a sickness that has no cure. I look at William, and I feel a longing that I know is sinful. I have prayed for God to take this feeling from me. He has not. I think perhaps I am damned. A week later, William and I were on picket duty together last night. We talked for hours. At one point he touched my shoulder, and I thought I would catch fire. I wanted to kiss him. I did not. I am a coward. September. I cannot stop thinking about him. I watch him across the camp, and I feel a hunger I do not know how to name. If anyone knew, I would be ruined. And yet, I cannot make myself stop. Richard Hall's diary was never meant to be read by anyone. He carried it with him throughout the war, and when he died, at the Battle of Chickamauga in September 1863, the diary was sent home with his personal effects. His family kept it, and in 1927, Richard's nephew donated the diary to the Georgia Historical Society, along with a note that said, "This diary contains some entries of a personal nature that may be distressing. I include it for the sake of historical completeness." The Georgia Historical Society sealed the diary. It was not opened again until 1985, when a graduate student doing research on the 4th Georgia Infantry requested access. The student read the diary. She wrote her dissertation on it. And in 1992, excerpts were published in an academic journal under the title Unspoken Love, A Confederate Officer's Private War. That is how we know that Richard Hall spent 2 years in love with a man who never knew, because William Bradford's diary also survived, and there is not a single mention of Richard in it beyond routine military matters. William thought they were friends. Richard was in agony. In his final entry, written 3 days before Chickamauga, Richard wrote this: I have decided that if I survive this war, I will tell William the truth. I cannot live the rest of my life with this secret. I would rather be rejected and know than spend 50 years wondering what he might have said. Richard Hall died before he could tell him. William Bradford survived. He went home to Georgia, married a woman named Catherine, had 4 children, and lived to the age of 71. His obituary in the Savannah Morning News described him as a devoted husband, a loving father, and a man of unimpeachable character. He never knew. This is the heartbreak of the Civil War's queer history. Some men loved in plain sight and called it friendship. Some men loved in secret and called it sin. And some men loved and died before they could ever say the word out loud. But there were also men who found ways to live their love fully, even in the middle of a war. Men who were careful. Men who were clever. Men who understood the rules and found the space between them. Let me take you back to Jerome and George. By the spring of 1863, they had been together for a year and a half. They had survived battles, disease, hunger, cold. They had watched men die. They had written letters home to the families of dead friends. They had become, in the language of the time, inseparable. And then, in April, the 37th Massachusetts was given a 2-week furlough. A gift from the War Department, a chance for the men to go home and see their families before the spring campaign began. Jerome and George went home to Massachusetts together. We know this from their diaries and from a letter George's mother wrote to a friend. The letter survives in a private family collection, and excerpts were published in a book called Massachusetts Volunteers, Letters from the Home Front. George's mother wrote, "George has come home with his friend Jerome. They arrived yesterday by train. Jerome is a sweet boy, very polite, a bit shy. George seems happier than I have seen him since before the war. They share George's old room. I am glad George has found such a good friend. This terrible war is easier to bear knowing he is not alone. They shared George's old room. For 2 weeks. Think about what that means." In 1863, in a respectable middle-class home in Dorchester, Massachusetts, 2 young men shared a bed for 2 weeks, and George's mother thought it was a sign of wholesome friendship. Because it was. Or at least, it was allowed to be. Jerome's diary from those 2 weeks is tender and aching. He writes about walking through Boston with George, visiting the Common, eating dinner with George's family, sitting in the parlor while George's younger sister played piano, and then, late at night, alone in George's room, he writes this: "I am happy. I do not think I have ever been this happy. We are home and we are safe, and for 2 weeks I can pretend the war does not exist." George and I talked tonight about what we will do when it is over. He wants to move west, to California perhaps, and start fresh. He asked if I would come with him. I said yes. I would follow him anywhere. 2 days later. Last night, George kissed me. We were in his room. The house was asleep, and he kissed me. I have thought about that moment for a year. It was everything I imagined. He said he has wanted to do that since the day we met. I told him I felt the same. We lay awake all night talking. We made plans. When the war ends, we will go west together. We will find a place where no one knows us. We will build a life. George's diary from the same night says this: "I kissed Jerome. I could not help myself. I love him. I have loved him for so long. He said he loves me too. I feel as though I am living in a dream. For the first time since this war began, I can imagine a future that does not end in mud and blood. A future with him." They had 10 more days. And then the furlough ended, and they took the train back to Virginia, and the war swallowed them again. The spring of 1863 was chaos. The Army of the Potomac, under its 4th commander in 2 years, was trying to outmaneuver Robert E. Lee in central Virginia. The result was the Battle of Chancellorsville in May, a stunning Confederate victory that cost the Union 17,000 casualties and convinced half the northern newspapers that the war was unwinnable. Jerome and George fought at Chancellorsville. They were both in the thick of it, part of a Union division that was flanked and nearly routed by Stonewall Jackson's surprise attack. Jerome wrote that he lost track of George during the battle, that he spent 2 hours in a blind panic thinking George was dead, until he found him sitting behind a tree, bleeding from a shallow cut on his arm, grinning like an idiot. George wrote, "Jerome found me. I've never been so relieved to see another human being." He bandaged my arm with a strip of his own shirt. Then he sat down next to me and started laughing. I asked him what was funny. He said, "We are still alive. That is funny." And then I started laughing too. We sat there in the middle of a battle, laughing like lunatics. They survived Chancellorsville. Barely. The 37th Massachusetts lost a third of its men. And then, in June, the Army of the Potomac was ordered north. Lee was invading Pennsylvania. The war was coming to a place called Gettysburg. Jerome and George marched north with their regiment. It took them 2 weeks to reach Pennsylvania. They marched through Maryland, through towns with names like Frederick and Emmitsburg, and the civilians came out to cheer them. Women handed out bread and water. Children waved flags. Old men stood on porches and saluted. Jerome wrote, "It feels strange to be cheered. We are not heroes. We are just boys who have not died yet." They reached Gettysburg on July 1st, 1863. The battle had already started. The 37th Massachusetts was held in reserve on the second day, and then thrown into the fight on the third day, during Pickett's charge. The disastrous Confederate assault that would break the back of Lee's army and turn the tide of the war. Jerome and George were positioned on Cemetery Ridge, right in the center of the Union line, when 15,000 Confederate soldiers came walking across an open field toward them. Jerome's diary entry from the night before the charge is short. He wrote, "Tomorrow will be bad. I can feel it. George and I have promised each other that if one of us dies, the other will write to his family. I do not want to think about it, but I made him promise, and he made me promise. I pray we both survive." They did, but it was close. Pickett's charge lasted less than an hour. 15,000 Confederates walked into a wall of artillery and rifle fire. Fewer than half of them made it back. The field was covered with bodies. The noise was unimaginable. Cannons, rifles, men screaming, horses dying. George wrote, "I have never seen anything like it. I fired my rifle until the barrel was too hot to touch. I reloaded without thinking. I did not aim. I just fired into the mass of men coming toward us. And then suddenly it was over. They were retreating. We had won. I looked around for Jerome, and I could not find him. I thought he was dead. I started shouting his name, and then I heard him shout back. He was 20 feet away, covered in mud and powder smoke, and he was alive. I ran to him. I wanted to hold him. I could not with the whole regiment watching. So I just stood there, staring at him, and he stared back, and we both started crying." Jerome's entry from the same day. "We won. I do not feel victorious. I feel numb. George is alive. That is all that matters." The Battle of Gettysburg ended on July 4th. The Confederates retreated. The Union did not pursue. Both armies were too exhausted, too bloodied, too broken. The 37th Massachusetts stayed in Pennsylvania for another week, burying the dead. Gettysburg had produced 51,000 casualties in 3 days. The bodies were everywhere. Soldiers, horses, civilians caught in the crossfire. The smell was unbearable. Jerome wrote, "We buried a boy today who looked about 15. Someone had gone through his pockets and left a letter from his mother. I read it. She told him to be brave and to come home safe. I folded the letter and put it back in his pocket before we covered him with dirt. I do not know why. It seemed important." George wrote, "I am so tired. I want to go home. I want this to be over. Jerome and I talked last night about deserting. We will not do it, but we talked about it." They did not desert. They stayed. And in August, the 37th Massachusetts was sent back to Virginia, back to the long, slow grind of the war, back to camp and marching and waiting for the next battle. And Jerome and George went with them, together, still alive, still in love, still unable to say it out loud to anyone but each other. By the fall of 1863, the war had become a war of attrition. No more grand battles. No more dramatic turning points. Just slow, grinding, bloody progress. The Union strategy was simple. Destroy the South's ability to fight, burn the farms, cut the railroads, starve the armies. It worked. But it took 2 more years. Jerome and George spent those 2 years together. They were transferred twice, fought in half a dozen smaller engagements, survived disease and exhaustion, and the grinding boredom of occupation duty. Their diaries continue, less frequent now, more weary. Jerome wrote in December of 1863, "I cannot remember what peace feels like." George wrote in March of 1864, 3 years. It has been 3 years since I enlisted. I thought it would be over in 6 months. But through it all, they had each other. And their diaries make it clear that their relationship deepened, became more central, more sustaining. Jerome wrote in June of 1864, "George is teaching me to play chess. We have a set carved from wood that he bought from a sutler for $2. We play every evening when there is light. I am terrible at it. George wins every time. I do not care. It gives us something to do besides think about the war." George wrote in the same month, "Jerome is a terrible chess player. He moves his pieces randomly and hopes for the best. But watching him concentrate, his forehead wrinkled, his tongue between his teeth, makes me happier than anything else in this godforsaken war." They were not alone in finding love in the middle of all that death. The conditions of the war, the enforced intimacy, the constant proximity to mortality, created a kind of emotional pressure cooker. Men fell in love because they had no one else, because they were lonely, because they were terrified, because love was the only thing that made any of it bearable. And the army, for the most part, let it happen. Because as long as men were bonding, as long as they were forming tight emotional units, they fought better. A soldier who loved his tent mate would not abandon him in battle. A soldier who had something to protect would hold the line when everything in him screamed to run. The Union Army understood this instinctively, so did the Confederacy. Both armies encouraged what they called messmate bonds, the pairing of soldiers who would share equipment, rations, and sleeping space. The idea was that 2 men who depended on each other would look out for each other. And if that dependence happened to include love, well, no one asked too many questions, unless you were stupid enough to get caught. There was a private in the 14th Indiana named Samuel Storrow. He was a farm boy from outside Indianapolis, 20 years old, enlisted in the summer of 1862. Samuel kept a diary that is now held at the Indiana Historical Society, and it is one of the strangest documents to survive the war, because Samuel Storrow wrote in code, not a sophisticated code, just a simple substitution cipher where he replaced certain words with symbols. The cipher key was written on the inside back cover of the diary, presumably so he could remember what meant what. The diary sat in an archive for 130 years before anyone bothered to decode it. In 1994, a librarian at the Indiana Historical Society noticed the symbols and got curious. She spent a weekend with the cipher key, transcribing the entries. And what she found was a detailed record of Samuel Storrow's sexual relationship with another soldier. The other soldier's name was Benjamin Kurtz. He was Samuel's messmate. They had enlisted together, trained together, fought together, and according to Samuel's diary, they had been lovers since the winter of 1862. Samuel wrote in code about kissing Benjamin in their tent, about touching him, about lying together after the rest of the camp was asleep. He wrote about the fear of being caught. He wrote about a close call in May of 1863, when a sergeant nearly walked in on them. He wrote, "We must be more careful. If anyone knew, we would both be shot." They were careful. For a year and a half, they managed to keep their relationship hidden. They slept in the same tent, shared the same blanket, and no one suspected anything because everyone was doing the same thing. But in November of 1863, something went wrong. Samuel's diary does not say exactly what happened. The entry from November 12th just says, "Benjamin is gone. They took him this morning. I do not know where. I am sick with fear. The next entry, November 15th. I have learned what happened. Benjamin was seen. Someone reported him. He has been arrested and is awaiting court-martial. I have not been implicated. I do not know if I should feel relieved or ashamed. November 20th. The court-martial was today. I was not allowed to attend. I heard from another soldier that Benjamin was found guilty of conduct unbecoming. He has been dishonorably discharged. They are sending him home. I will never see him again. That is the last mention of Benjamin Kurtz in Samuel's diary. Samuel stopped writing in code after that. The rest of the diary is just routine military observations, weather, rations, marching orders. No more personal entries, no more feelings. Samuel Storrow survived the war. He went home to Indiana and married a woman named Margaret in 1867. They had 5 children. Samuel died in 1903. His obituary described him as a faithful husband and a pillar of the community. His diary was donated to the Historical Society by his grandson in 1961. No one read it carefully until 1994. Benjamin Kurtz disappeared. There is no record of what happened to him after his discharge. He does not appear in any census records. He does not appear in any city directories. Either he changed his name, or he moved far away, or he died young and unrecorded. We will never know. But we know that for a year and a half, in the middle of the Civil War, 2 men loved each other. And we know that when they were discovered, one of them was erased. That is the other side of the Civil War's queer history. For every Jerome and George who found a way to survive, there was a Benjamin Kurtz who did not. The rules were simple. You could love another man as long as you called it friendship. You could sleep beside him as long as you did not get caught doing anything more. You could write passionate letters as long as you used the approved language. But if you stepped outside those boundaries, if you made your desire explicit, if you got caught, if someone reported you, then the army would destroy you. And the thing that made it even more dangerous was that the boundaries were not consistent. What counted as acceptable intimacy in one regiment might get you court-martialed in another. Some officers turned a blind eye. Some officers actively looked for signs of sodomy and prosecuted aggressively. It depended entirely on who was in charge. There was a Union colonel named Marcus Reno, yes, the same Reno who would later serve under Custer at Little Bighorn, who was known throughout the Army of the Potomac as a hard-ass about soldier morality. Reno commanded the 12th Pennsylvania Cavalry, and he had a reputation for throwing men in the stockade for the slightest hint of impropriety. In the spring of 1864, Reno court-martialed 3 men in a single week, one for drunkenness, one for insubordination, and one for what the record describes as inappropriate intimacy with another soldier. The third case involved a private named Daniel Foster and a corporal named William Hayes. They had been seen sitting too close together by a campfire. That was it. Sitting too close. A lieutenant reported them. Reno ordered an investigation. The investigation turned up nothing concrete. No one had witnessed anything sexual. No one had seen them in a compromising position. But several soldiers testified that Foster and Hayes were unusually devoted to each other, and that they spent an inordinate amount of time alone together. That was enough for Reno. Both men were found guilty of conduct unbecoming and were dishonorably discharged. The trial transcript is 3 pages long. It is held at the National Archives, and it is a perfect example of how subjective the enforcement of morality laws could be. 2 men were drummed out of the army for sitting too close to each other. Meanwhile, in another regiment 100 miles away, Jerome and George were sleeping in the same bedroll every night, and no one cared. It was arbitrary, it was cruel, and it meant that every queer soldier in the Union Army was walking a tightrope, never quite sure where the line was, or when someone might decide they had crossed it. Jerome and George were lucky. Their officers did not care. Their regiment did not care. And because they were careful, because they never made their love explicit in front of others, because they kept their physical intimacy private, they survived. But the fear was always there. George wrote in July of 1864, "Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, convinced that someone has seen us, that someone knows, that they are coming to arrest Jerome. I lie there in the dark, listening to him breathe, and I imagine what I would do if they took him. I think I would confess. I think I would tell them it was all me, that I seduced him, that he is innocent. I would rather be ruined than watch him suffer. Jerome wrote a week later. George has nightmares. He does not tell me what they are about, but I know. He wakes up gasping, and I hold him until he calms down. Last night he whispered that he is afraid we will be separated. I told him that will never happen. I do not know if that is true, but I needed him to believe it. By the summer of 1864, the war had reached a kind of grim equilibrium. In the east, Ulysses S. Grant was slowly grinding down Robert E. Lee's army in a series of brutal battles, the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, that cost the Union 50,000 casualties in 6 weeks. In the west, William Tecumseh Sherman was marching toward Atlanta, burning everything in his path. The Confederacy was dying, everyone knew it, but it was dying slowly, and it was taking tens of thousands of men with it. The 37th Massachusetts was pulled out of the line in August and sent to Washington for garrison duty. It was supposed to be a rest, a break from the fighting, a chance to recover. Jerome wrote, "We are in Washington. We have real beds. We have regular meals. We are not being shot at. It feels like a dream." George wrote, "I do not trust this. Something always goes wrong." He was right. In September of 1864, the 37th Massachusetts was ordered to participate in a prisoner exchange at City Point, Virginia. Prisoner exchanges had been happening sporadically throughout the war. The Union and the Confederacy would trade captured soldiers, usually at a rate of 1 officer for 6 enlisted men. It was supposed to be a humanitarian gesture. In practice, it was a logistical nightmare. The exchange at City Point involved more than 3,000 men, Union prisoners coming back from Confederate camps, Confederate prisoners going back south. The whole thing was chaos, crowds of sick, starving men trying to figure out where they were supposed to go, trying to find their regiments, trying to stay upright long enough to be processed. Jerome and George were assigned to help manage the arriving Union prisoners. Their job was to register names, assign temporary quarters, and make sure no one died of exhaustion before they could be sent home. It was during this assignment that Jerome met a man who would haunt him for the rest of his life. The man's name was Thomas Withers. He was a private from Ohio, captured at the Battle of Chickamauga in September of 1863, and held at Andersonville Prison in Georgia for 11 months. If you know anything about Civil War history, you know what Andersonville was. If you do not, let me tell you, it was hell on earth. A Confederate prison camp designed to hold 10,000 men that ended up holding 33,000. No shelter, no sanitation, no medical care. Men died of starvation, disease, exposure. 13,000 men died at Andersonville over the course of 14 months. 13,000. Thomas Withers had survived it. Barely. Jerome described him in his diary. "He is a skeleton. I do not think he weighs more than 90 pounds. His eyes are sunken. His skin is grey. He can barely stand. And yet he is alive." Jerome was assigned to help Thomas find his regiment and arrange transport home. They spent 2 hours together, filling out paperwork, and during that time, Thomas told Jerome about Andersonville. He told him about the hunger, about watching men die of scurvy because there were no vegetables, about the fights over scraps of food, about the creek that ran through the camp, which was the only source of water and also the only place to defecate, so everyone was drinking sewage. And then Thomas told Jerome something else, something Jerome almost did not write down, something he clearly struggled with, because the diary entry is full of crossed-out lines and restarts. Jerome wrote, "Thomas told me that at Andersonville, some men survived by forming what he called protective pairs. 2 men who would share resources, guard each other, keep each other alive. He said the guards did not care. He said as long as men were not causing trouble, the guards let them do whatever they needed to do to survive." Jerome crossed out the next sentence. Then he wrote it again. Then he crossed it out again. Finally, he wrote, Thomas said he had a partner at Andersonville, another prisoner, a man from Pennsylvania named Robert. He said they kept each other alive for 9 months. And then Robert got sick with dysentery and died in Thomas's arms. Thomas said he does not know how to go home and explain to anyone what Robert meant to him. He said no one would understand. Jerome wrote, I told him I understood. That is all. The entry ends there. But the fact that Jerome wrote it down at all, the fact that he struggled with it, crossed it out, rewrote it, suggests that Thomas's story shook him, because Thomas had just described exactly what Jerome and George were doing, except under conditions so extreme that there was no room for pretense. At Andersonville, love was not romantic. It was survival. And Thomas Withers had found it, and lost it, and now he was going home to a world that would never let him talk about it. Jerome never saw Thomas again, but he thought about him. A week later he wrote, I cannot stop thinking about the man from Andersonville, about how he survived hell because he had someone to survive it with. George and I have been lucky. We have had clean water and regular food and only occasional danger. What would we do if we were tested the way Thomas was? Would we survive? Would our love be strong enough? George, in his own diary, wrote, Jerome has been quiet since the prisoner exchange. I asked him what was wrong. He said he had been thinking about how fragile everything is, how easily we could lose each other. I told him we will not. I do not know if I believe that, but I needed him to hear it. The war ground on. Fall turned to winter. The 37th Massachusetts was sent back to the front in Virginia, where Grant was besieging Petersburg in a campaign that would last 9 months and kill 70,000 men. Jerome and George dug trenches. They slept in mud. They ate hardtack that was more weevil than bread. They watched men die of disease and boredom and the occasional sniper bullet. And they stayed together. George wrote in December of 1864, 2 years. Jerome and I have been together for more than 2 years. I cannot imagine my life without him. I cannot imagine waking up and not seeing his face. This war has taken everything from me, my health, my youth, my faith in humanity. But it gave me him. I do not know if that is a fair trade, but it is the only trade I have. Jerome wrote in January of 1865, I am so tired. I want to go home. I want this to be over, but I am also afraid of what comes after. The war has given George and me an excuse to be together. What happens when the war ends? What happens when we are expected to go back to normal life, to marry, to be respectable? I do not want that life. I want this life. I want him, but I do not know if the world will let us keep each other. It is a question that thousands of queer soldiers must have asked themselves as the war dragged toward its end. What happens after? How do you go back to a world that does not have space for what you have become? Some men found ways. They moved west, where no one knew them. They set up households together and called themselves business partners or cousins. They built quiet lives in the margins of respectability. Some men got married and tried to forget. They buried their love under layers of duty and normalcy and died without ever speaking of it again. And some men could not let go. They stayed together as long as they could, and when they were forced apart, they grieved for the rest of their lives. Jerome and George were determined to be in the first category. They made plans. George's diary from February of 1865 includes detailed notes about California, what it would cost to get there, what kind of work they could find, how they could set up a household without attracting suspicion. Jerome wrote, George has a plan. He always has a plan. We will go to San Francisco. We will open a bookshop. We will live above the shop. We will tell people we are brothers. No one will question it. We will finally be free. It was a beautiful plan. And then, on April 9th, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, and the war was over. The 37th Massachusetts was still in Virginia when the news came. Jerome described the scene. Men are cheering. Guns are firing in the air. Someone found a barrel of whiskey and everyone is drinking. The war is over. We won. I should feel happy. I feel terrified. George wrote, "The war is over. Jerome and I held each other in the tent and cried. I do not know if we were crying because it is over or because we do not know what comes next." What came next was demobilization. The Union Army, which had swelled to over 1 million men, began sending soldiers home. Regiments were disbanded. Men were given their discharge papers and train tickets and sent back to the lives they had left 3 or 4 years earlier. The 37th Massachusetts was mustered out in June of 1865. Jerome and George rode the train back to Boston together. They stayed with George's family for a week, and then Jerome went home to Williamstown, and George stayed in Dorchester, and for the first time in 3 years, they were separated. Jerome's diary from that summer is full of longing. He wrote letters to George every day. He described feeling untethered, lost, like part of him was missing. He wrote, "I do not know how to be in this world without him. Everything feels wrong. I went to church with my mother, and I sat through the sermon, and all I could think was that George was not there. I had dinner with my father, and he asked me about my plans, and I lied. I told him I was thinking about going back to teaching. What I wanted to say was that I am thinking about running away to California with the man I love. But I could not." George's letters to Jerome from the same period have not survived. We only know they existed because Jerome mentions receiving them. He wrote, "George's letter arrived today. He is struggling too. He says his mother is pressuring him to settle down, to find a wife. He says he is trying to delay. He says he needs me to be patient. I am trying." They lasted 3 months. In September of 1865, Jerome packed a bag, told his parents he was moving to California to seek his fortune, and took a train to Boston. He met George at the station. They bought tickets west, and they left. We know this because both Jerome and George kept writing in their diaries during the journey west. The entries are sporadic. They were traveling, they were exhausted, they were starting a new life. But what survives is extraordinary. Jerome wrote from a hotel in Chicago, "We are halfway to California. George is asleep beside me. We have our own room. No one questions it, no one cares. For the first time in my life, I feel like I can breathe." George wrote from a stagecoach station in Nebraska, "Jerome is teaching me to cook. We bought supplies at a general store and made dinner over a fire behind the station. I burned the beans. He laughed at me. I have never been happier." They reached San Francisco in November of 1865. The city was booming. Gold rush money, railroad money, a chaotic mix of prospectors and businessmen and people trying to reinvent themselves far from the judgmental eyes of the East Coast. It was exactly the kind of place where 2 men could disappear. They rented a small apartment on Telegraph Hill. They found work, Jerome as a clerk in a shipping office, George as a bookkeeper for a dry goods merchant. They saved money. And in the spring of 1866, they opened a bookshop on Montgomery Street, exactly as they had planned. The shop was called Robbins and Crehor. It sold new and used books, maps, newspapers. It stayed open for 23 years. We know this because the shop appears in San Francisco city directories from 1866 to 1889. We know Jerome and George lived together at the address listed for the shop, an apartment on the 2nd floor. We know they were listed in census records as business partners. We know they were respected members of the community because both of them appear in social notices in the San Francisco Chronicle, attending lectures, donating to charities, hosting literary events. And we know that no one, as far as we can tell, ever questioned their relationship because they had figured out the code. Business partners, 2 men who shared a household for financial reasons. It was common enough in the 19th century, especially in Western cities where housing was expensive and single men were plentiful. As long as Jerome and George maintained the appearance of propriety, as long as they did not flaunt their love, as long as they kept their physical intimacy private, they were safe. They lived together for 31 years. Jerome died in 1896 of pneumonia. He was 57 years old. His obituary in the San Francisco Chronicle described him as a beloved member of the city's literary community and noted that he was survived by his business partner, George Crehor. George lived another 12 years. He closed the bookshop after Jerome died. He moved to a smaller apartment. And according to a letter he wrote to Jerome's sister in 1897, a letter that was saved and is now part of the Massachusetts Historical Society collection, he spent the rest of his life grieving. The letter says, "I do not know how to live without him. We were together for more than 30 years. He was my dearest friend, my partner, the person I loved most in the world. I know that I should move on, that I should find new purpose, but I cannot. Every room in this city reminds me of him. I see his face everywhere. I hear his voice. I miss him more than I can bear." George Crehor died in 1908. His obituary said he was survived by no one. He was buried in Laurel Hill Cemetery in San Francisco, in a plot he had purchased years earlier. And when the cemetery was relocated in the 1940s and the graves were moved to Cypress Lawn Memorial Park in Colma, someone noticed that the plot George had bought was a double plot. Jerome was already buried there. They are still there, side by side. Two weathered headstones, close enough to touch. The headstones say, Jerome Robbins, 1839, 1896, beloved friend, and George Crehor, 1837, 1908, faithful partner. That is what they were allowed to say. Beloved friend, faithful partner. The only words the 19th century had for two men who loved each other for more than 3 decades. But we know what they really were. Because their diaries survived. Because they wrote down the truth, even when they could not speak it out loud. Because someone, 100 years later, read those diaries and understood. Jerome and George were two of the lucky ones. They survived the war. They built a life together. They died old in a city far from the battlefields, in a world that was kinder to them than it had any right to be. But for every Jerome and George, there were a dozen men who were not so lucky. Men who died in the war. Men who went home and tried to forget. Men who were caught and ruined. Men whose love was erased so thoroughly that we do not even know their names. Let me tell you about some of them. There was a Confederate sergeant named Elijah Morse from Alabama. He kept a diary that was discovered in an estate sale in the 1970s. The diary is fragmentary. Pages are missing. Some entries are water damaged, but what survives includes several passages about a fellow soldier named Jacob. Elijah wrote in October of 1862, "Jacob and I have become inseparable. He is the best man I know. I would trust him with my life." In December, "I think about Jacob constantly. When we are apart, I feel incomplete." In February of 1863, "Last night Jacob and I talked until dawn. He told me things he has never told anyone. I told him the same. I think we understand each other in a way that no one else ever will." That is the last entry about Jacob. The next entry is dated April 1863, and it just says, "Jacob is dead, killed at Chancellorsville. I do not know how to go on." The rest of the diary is military observations. No more personal entries, no more feelings. Elijah Morse survived the war and went home to Alabama. There is no record of what happened to him after that. There was a Union corporal named Andrew Billings from Maine. He wrote letters to his sister throughout the war, and in one of those letters, dated August 1864, he mentioned a soldier named Peter. Andrew wrote, "I have made a dear friend here. His name is Peter. We share a tent, and he keeps me sane in this madness. I do not think I could survive this war without him." 3 weeks later, Andrew wrote again, "Peter has been transferred to another regiment. I am devastated. I know that sounds dramatic, but it is true. I feel as though I have lost a part of myself." Andrew survived the war. He went home to Maine and married a woman named Sarah in 1867. He had 3 children. He never mentioned Peter again in any of his surviving letters. there was a Confederate private named Henry Morton from Tennessee. His diary is held at the Tennessee State Library. In the spring of 1863, Henry wrote extensively about another soldier named Samuel. Henry wrote, "Samuel is the finest man I have ever known. He is brave, kind, and has a laugh that makes everything better." In June, "I have never felt this way about anyone. I do not know what to call it. All I know is that when I am with Samuel, the world feels right." In August, Samuel told me he feels the same. "We have agreed that when the war is over, we will find a way to stay together. I do not know how we will manage it, but we will try." Henry Morton was killed at the Battle of Chickamauga in September of 1863. He was 22 years old. There is no record of what happened to Samuel. These fragments are all we have. Pieces of lives, glimpses of love, and most of the time, we do not even have that much. Most of the queer soldiers who fought in the Civil War left no record at all. They wrote no diaries. They sent no letters. Or if they did, those documents were destroyed by families who were ashamed, by executors who thought the contents were inappropriate, by archivists who did not consider them worth saving. How many love stories were burned? How many names were lost? We will never know. But we can make some educated guesses about the scale of queer life in the Civil War, based on what we do know about human sexuality and the conditions of the war. More than 2 million men served in the Union Army. More than 1 million served in the Confederate Army. If we assume that roughly 5 to 10% of the population has always been queer, a conservative estimate based on modern research, that means somewhere between 150,000 and 300,000 queer men fought in the Civil War. Let that number sit with you for a moment. 250,000 men. Gay, bisexual, men who loved other men. All of them navigating a world that had no language for what they were. All of them trying to survive a war while also surviving their own desire. Some of them figured it out. Some of them found love. Some of them built lives. Most of them suffered in silence. And here is the really devastating part. We have records for maybe a few dozen of them. Out of 250,000, we have solid documentation for perhaps 30 or 40 individuals whose queerness is undeniable. The rest are invisible, erased, lost to history. This is what erasure looks like, not a dramatic act of destruction, just silence. Just the slow, quiet disappearance of people who were never allowed to speak their truth out loud. But even in the silence, there are echoes, patterns, details that suggest a much larger story. Consider this. The language of romantic friendship saturates Civil War letters and diaries. Thousands of soldiers wrote to each other in terms that sound, to modern ears, unmistakably romantic. Phrases like, "I long for you," and "I cannot bear to be apart from you," and "You are my dearest treasure," appear over and over again in letters between men who were supposedly just friends. Historians have spent decades debating what this means. Some argue that it is just the flowery language of the Victorian era, that men in the 19th century were more emotionally expressive, and we should not read modern categories into historical texts. Others argue that this is exactly what queer love looked like in a world that refused to name it, that these letters are evidence of relationships that were sexual and romantic, even if the men involved never used those words. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Some of these relationships were platonic. Some were deeply romantic but not sexual. Some were fully sexual but carefully hidden. And some existed in a space that our modern categories cannot quite capture. Intimacy that included physical affection, emotional devotion, and a bond that was more than friendship but not quite what we would call a relationship. The point is, queer desire has always existed. It existed in 1862, just as it exists now. And the Civil War, with its unique conditions, its enforced intimacy, its proximity to death, its breakdown of normal social structures, created spaces where that desire could be expressed, even if it could never be fully acknowledged. Let me give you another example. There was a tradition in both the Union and Confederate armies called bunking. Two soldiers would declare themselves bunkmates and would share all their resources: tent, blanket, rations, pay. The army encouraged this because it created accountability. If one man got sick, the other would care for him. If one man deserted, the other would report it. But bunking also created cover for romantic relationships, because once you were declared bunkmates, it was expected that you would sleep together, spend all your time together, be inseparable. No one questioned it. It was official policy, and some men took advantage of that. There is a record from a Union quartermaster in 1863 that lists the bunking assignments for an entire regiment. The list includes a note next to two names. Privates Miller and Thompson refused to bunk with anyone else and have requested to remain paired indefinitely. That is all the note says. But think about what it implies. Two men who refused to be separated. Two men who insisted on staying together, no matter what. Was it friendship? Was it love? We will never know. But the fact that they fought to stay paired, that they made it official, put it in the record, suggests it mattered to them in a way that went beyond convenience. How many other soldiers did the same thing? How many men used the cover of bunking to build relationships that the army would never have tolerated if they had been honest about what they were? We do not have numbers. We do not have names. What we have are hints, suggestions, the shape of something larger that we can only glimpse through the gaps in the historical record. And then there are the photographs. Civil War soldiers loved having their photographs taken. Photography was still relatively new, still magical, and soldiers would pose for portraits to send home to their families. Thousands of these photographs survive, held in archives and museums and private collections all over the country. And if you look closely at those photographs, you start to notice patterns. There are hundreds, maybe thousands, of photographs of two soldiers posing together, sitting close, arms around each other, hands on each other's shoulders or knees, leaning into each other in ways that look, to modern eyes, unmistakably intimate. Now, some of this was just the convention of the time. Men in the 19th century were more physically affectionate with each other than men are now. A hand on the shoulder was not necessarily romantic. Sitting close was not necessarily sexual. But some of these photographs go further. There are images of men holding hands, men with their heads on each other's shoulders, men gazing at each other with expressions that are difficult to read as anything other than love. One of the most striking examples is a photograph held at the Library of Congress. It shows two Union soldiers seated side by side, both in full uniform. One of them has his arm around the other's waist. The other is leaning into him, his head tilted slightly toward his companion's shoulder. They are both looking directly at the camera, unsmiling, the way everyone looked in 19th century photographs, because exposure times were long and you had to hold still. But the intimacy is unmistakable, the way they are touching, the way they are positioned, the ease of it. The photograph is labelled Unknown Soldiers, circa 1863. That is all we know. No names, no regiment, no story. Just two men, frozen in time, holding each other. How many photographs like this exist? How many were destroyed by families who thought they were inappropriate? How many are sitting in attics and estate sales, uncatalogued and unrecognized? And here is the question that haunts me. How many of those men survived the war? How many of them went home and tried to build lives together, like Jerome and George? And how many of them were separated, sent back to different states, forced to marry and forget, and spend the rest of their lives pretending that what they had was nothing more than friendship? We will never know. But we know it happened. We know because of the letters that survived. Letters from men who went home after the war and wrote to the men they had loved. Letters full of longing and regret. There is a letter in the Ohio Historical Society, written in 1867 by a man named Charles Hammond to a man named Frederick Pierce. Charles and Frederick had served together in the 66th Ohio Infantry. They had been bunkmates for 2 years, and after the war they went home to different towns, Charles to Cleveland, Frederick to Cincinnati, and they tried to move on. The letter says, "I think of you often, more than I should. I know we agreed it was best to go our separate ways, to build respectable lives, but I cannot stop missing you. I miss our conversations. I miss waking up and seeing your face. I miss knowing that you were there. My life here is fine. I have a good job, a nice home, but it feels empty without you." There is no record of whether Frederick wrote back. There is another letter, held at the Virginia Historical Society, written in 1870 by a former Confederate soldier named Robert Keene to a man named Daniel Shaw. Robert and Daniel had served together in the 3rd Virginia Cavalry. The letter says, "I heard you got married last month. I am happy for you. Truly. I hope she is good to you. I hope you are happy. I just wanted you to know that I have not forgotten you. I never will. What we had during the war was the most important thing in my life. I know we cannot speak of it now. I know we have to pretend it was nothing. But it was not nothing. Not to me." These letters are heartbreaking because they show us the cost of survival. These men made it through the war alive. They went home. They did what was expected of them. And they spent the rest of their lives grieving for something they were never allowed to keep. How many men lived that way? How many carried the memory of a tent mate, a bunkmate, a fellow soldier they had loved in secret, and spent decades pretending it had meant nothing? Thousands, tens of thousands, maybe more. This is the untold story of the Civil War. Not just the battles and the generals and the grand political drama, but the quiet personal tragedies, the loves that could not survive peace, the men who found each other in the chaos of war and lost each other in the return to normalcy. And the worst part is that most of these men had no framework for understanding what they had lost, because the concept of a gay identity did not exist yet. The idea that you could be a certain kind of person, that your attraction to men was a fundamental part of who you were, was not available to them. What they had instead was confusion, shame, a sense that they were broken or sinful or uniquely cursed. They did not have the language to say, "I am gay." All they could say was, "I feel things I should not feel." And so they buried it. They married women they did not love. They had children they were supposed to want. They built lives that looked respectable from the outside. And they died without ever telling anyone the truth. Except sometimes they wrote it down, in diaries, in letters, in private documents they thought no one would ever read. And sometimes those documents survived. And sometimes, 150 years later, someone found them and read them and understood. That is how we know. Not because the men themselves ever got to speak their truth out loud, but because they left breadcrumbs, clues, fragments of evidence that, when pieced together, reveal a hidden history. A history of love, of survival, of men who found each other in the middle of a war and held on to each other as tightly as they could, for as long as they were allowed. And some of those men did not just write it down. Some of them lived it, openly, defiantly, in ways that got them noticed, got them punished, got them written into the official record as cautionary tales. Let me tell you about a soldier named Newton Curtis. He was a captain in the 127th New York Infantry. He was also one of the few openly gender non-conforming men in the Union Army whose story was documented in detail. Newton Curtis was what the Army called peculiar. He wore his hair long. He sewed elaborate embroidery onto his uniform. He carried a parasol on sunny days. He spoke in what one fellow officer described as an affected manner more suited to a lady's parlour than a military camp. And he was very good at his job. Curtis was promoted to major in 1863 and to brigadier general by the end of the war. He led troops at Fort Fisher, one of the last major Confederate strongholds, and was awarded the Medal of Honor for his bravery. His men loved him, his superiors respected him, and his fellow officers thought he was the strangest man they had ever met. There are dozens of references to Curtis in other soldiers' letters and diaries. Most of them are bemused. Some are outright hostile. A lieutenant named George Whitman, brother of the poet Walt Whitman, wrote in a letter home, There is an officer in our division who is unlike any man I have ever encountered. He is brave in battle but carries himself like a woman. The men call him the General in Lace. I do not know what to make of him. A private named Samuel Comfort wrote, "Captain Curtis is strange but kind. He speaks to the enlisted men as if we are human beings, which is more than most officers do. I do not care if he wears lace. He treats us well." And a Confederate prisoner who was interrogated by Curtis wrote in his diary, "I was questioned today by a Yankee officer who looked like he had raided his sister's wardrobe. He was polite. He offered me water. I do not understand these people." Newton Curtis never married. After the war, he moved to New York City and lived in a boarding house with several other unmarried men. He worked as a customs inspector and wrote a memoir called From Bull Run to Chancellorsville, which was published in 1906. The memoir is entirely about military strategy. It does not mention his personal life at all. Curtis died in 1910. His obituary in the New York Times called him an eccentric but distinguished officer, and noted that he was survived by no immediate family. He was buried in Arlington National Cemetery. His gravestone says, "Newton Martin Curtis, Brigadier General, Medal of Honor." It does not say anything else. It does not need to. Because Newton Curtis lived his truth as fully as the 19th century would allow. He wore lace to war. He carried a parasol. He refused to conform. And he survived. Not every gender non-conforming soldier was so lucky. There was a private in the 95th Illinois named Albert Cashier. Except Albert Cashier was not actually named Albert, and Albert was not actually a man. Albert Cashier was assigned female at birth. His birth name was Jenny Hodges, and he enlisted in the Union Army in 1862, fought in 40 battles, and served for 3 years without anyone discovering his secret. Albert was 5 feet tall and weighed less than 100 pounds. He had no facial hair. His voice was high, and yet somehow, he convinced the army he was male. He bound his chest. He wore oversized uniforms. He avoided the communal bathing areas. And he fought. He fought at Vicksburg. He fought at the Red River Campaign. He fought at Nashville. He was captured briefly by Confederates and escaped. He was a good soldier. No one questioned him. After the war, Albert went home to Illinois and continued living as a man. He worked odd jobs: farmhand, lamplighter, janitor. He collected a veteran's pension. He voted in elections, which women were not allowed to do. He lived as Albert Cashier for 53 years. And then, in 1911, Albert was hit by a car. He was taken to a hospital. The doctors examined him, and they discovered that Albert Cashier had a female body. The news broke quietly at first. The hospital kept it confidential. But eventually word got out. Newspapers picked up the story. Headlines screamed, "Woman fought in Civil War. Female soldier's secret revealed." The state of Illinois tried to revoke Albert's pension, arguing that he had committed fraud by enlisting under false pretenses. But his fellow veterans rallied to his defense. Men he had served with testified that Albert had been a good soldier, that he had done his duty, that he deserved his pension regardless of what body he had been born into. One veteran, a man named Robert Horan, said in a deposition, "I fought beside Albert Cashier at Vicksburg. He was as brave as any man I knew. I do not care what the doctors say he is. He was a soldier. He earned his pension." The state backed down. Albert kept his pension. But the damage was done. Albert was placed in a psychiatric hospital, where the staff forced him to wear dresses. He spent the last years of his life in clothes he had not worn since childhood, surrounded by people who insisted on calling him Jenny. Albert Cashier died in 1915. He was 71 years old. He was buried in his Union Army uniform at his own request. The gravestone says, "Albert D.J. Cashier, Co. G. 95 Ill Inf." And here is the question historians have been asking ever since. Was Albert Cashier a woman disguised as a man in order to fight in the war? Or was Albert Cashier a transgender man who used the war as an opportunity to live as his true self. We will never know for sure. Albert never left a diary. He never wrote about his reasons. All we have are the facts. He lived as a man for more than 50 years. He fought for the right to keep living as a man even after his body was discovered. And he asked to be buried as a man. That sounds like someone who knew exactly who he was. But the 19th century had no framework for understanding that. Transgender identity was not a concept. The word did not exist. So Albert's story was recorded as a curiosity. A woman who pretended to be a man. A strange historical footnote. It was not until the 21st century that historians began to re-examine Albert Cashier's story through a transgender lens. And once you do that, once you allow for the possibility that Albert was a man, not a woman in disguise, but an actual man who happened to have been assigned female at birth, the whole story shifts. Suddenly, it is not a story about deception. It is a story about survival. About a person who found a way to live authentically in a world that would never have allowed it otherwise. And Albert was not the only one. There are records of at least 4 other soldiers in the Civil War who were assigned female at birth and fought as men. Their names were Sarah Rosetta Wakeman, who enlisted as Lyons Wakeman, Frances Clayton, who fought alongside her husband and continued fighting after he was killed, Sarah Emma Edmonds, who enlisted as Franklin Thompson, and Loretta Janetta Velasquez, who claimed to have fought for the Confederacy as Harry Buford, though some historians doubt her account. Some of these people were women disguising themselves as men in order to fight. Some of them may have been transgender. We cannot know for certain, but what we do know is that the Civil War created a space where people could reinvent themselves, where someone assigned female at birth could put on a uniform, take a new name, and live as a man for years without being discovered. And if that was possible for people crossing gender lines, how much easier was it for men who loved men? Men who already had male bodies, male names, male social roles. Men who just needed to be careful about where they directed their desire. The Civil War was a queer space, not because everyone in it was queer, but because the normal rules of society were suspended. Men lived in close quarters. They touched each other constantly. They slept together, bathed together, cared for each other in ways that would have been suspicious in civilian life, but were completely normal in the army. And in that suspension of normal rules, queer people found room to breathe. Some of them, like Jerome and George, found love and kept it. Some of them, like Albert Cashier, found a way to live as their true selves. Some of them, like Newton Curtis, found the freedom to be visibly different and still be respected. But most of them just survived. They kept their heads down. They followed the rules. They loved quietly, if they loved at all. And they went home and disappeared back into the closets that civilian life required. The war was a break in time, a 4-year window when different rules applied. And when it closed, most queer soldiers went back to lives that had no space for who they had been during the war. But some of them refused. There was a Union veteran named Levi Schofield from Ohio. He had served in the 64th Ohio Infantry and had been bunkmates with a man named Edward Sears for most of the war. After the war, Levi and Edward both went home to Cleveland, and they moved in together. They shared a house on Prospect Avenue for 32 years. They ran a printing business together. They were members of the same church, the same veterans association, the same social clubs. And as far as anyone could tell, they were just 2 bachelor friends who found it economical to share expenses. Except that when Levi died in 1897, his will left everything to Edward. The house, the business, his personal effects, everything. And the will included a line that said, "To my beloved companion Edward, without whom my life would have been empty and meaningless." Edward lived in that house for another 14 years. And when he died in 1911, he was buried next to Levi in Riverside Cemetery. The graves are side by side. The headstones match. No one in Cleveland thought it was strange, or if they did, they kept it to themselves, because Levi and Edward had been careful. They had used the right language. Companions, friends, business partners. As long as they stayed within that script, they were safe. And they were not unique. If you go digging through cemetery records, through census data, through city directories and probate files, you start to find patterns. Pairs of men who served together in the Civil War and then lived together for decades afterward. Men who shared households, shared finances, and were buried side by side. How many of these pairs were romantic? How many were sexual? How many were just close friends who found it convenient to live together? We will never know. But the sheer number of them suggests that something more was happening than just economic convenience. There was a pair in Pennsylvania, two veterans named Joseph Kirk and Samuel Ward, who shared a farm outside Gettysburg for 40 years. There was a pair in Massachusetts, Daniel Foster and William Hayes, yes, the same two men who had been court-martialed by Colonel Reno for sitting too close together. They were acquitted on a technicality, served out the rest of the war, and then moved to Boston together. They ran a tailor shop. They lived above the shop. They were together until Daniel died in 1903. There was a pair in Tennessee, two Confederate veterans named James Polk and Henry Grimes, who homesteaded together in the mountains outside Chattanooga. They raised sheep. They lived in a cabin with one bedroom. The neighbors called them the old bachelors on the ridge. These men existed. They are in the records. And once you start looking for them, you see them everywhere. The Civil War created bonds that lasted lifetimes. Some of those bonds were platonic. Some were romantic. Some were sexual. Most existed in a space that our modern categories cannot quite capture. But they mattered. To the men involved, they mattered more than anything. And here is the tragedy. Almost none of them ever got to say so out loud. Almost none of them got to call their love by its real name. They had to use code, friendship, companionship, partnership, words that were safe but insufficient. Jerome and George used those words. So did Levi and Edward. So did hundreds or thousands of other men whose names we will never know. But in their private writings, in the diaries and letters they thought no one would read, they told the truth. Jerome wrote, "I love him." George wrote, "He is everything to me." Elijah wrote, "I cannot live without him." Andrew wrote, "I have never felt this way about anyone." Those words were dangerous. So dangerous that most of these men never wrote them down at all. So dangerous that when they did write them down, they hid the documents or destroyed them, or left instructions for them to be burned after their deaths. But some of those documents survived anyway, hidden in attics, forgotten in boxes, donated to archives by descendants who never read them carefully. And now, more than 150 years later, we can read them. We can piece together the story. And the story is this. Queer people have always existed. We have always found each other. We have always loved each other, even in the middle of the bloodiest war in American history, even in a world that had no language for what we were. We found ways to survive and to love. That is the legacy of the Civil War's queer soldiers. Not just that they fought, not just that they served, but that they loved, in secret, in silence, in ways that history tried very hard to erase. But we are still here, and so are their stories. There is one more story I need to tell you. It is the darkest one, but it is important. Not every queer soldier survived the war with their dignity intact. Not every love story had even a bittersweet ending. Some men were caught, some were punished, and some were destroyed so thoroughly that their names only survive in court-martial records and discharge papers. There was a private in the 18th Pennsylvania Cavalry named Michael Sullivan. In the summer of 1864, he was accused of committing sodomy with another soldier, a private named Thomas Reed. The accusation came from a corporal who claimed he had seen the two men together in a barn, partially undressed, engaged in what the court-martial transcript calls unnatural acts. Both men were arrested. Both were court-martialed. The trial lasted 2 days. Thomas Reed testified that Michael Sullivan had forced him, that he had been assaulted, that he had tried to resist and had been overpowered. Michael Sullivan testified that Thomas had been willing, that they had been in a relationship for months, that everything that happened in that barn had been consensual. The court believed Thomas. Michael Sullivan was found guilty of sodomy and assault. He was sentenced to 5 years of hard labor at a military prison in Ohio. He was dishonorably discharged. Thomas Reed was found not guilty. He was reassigned to another regiment and served out the rest of the war. And here is where the story gets complicated, because we have no way of knowing what actually happened in that barn. Did Michael assault Thomas, or did Thomas panic when they were discovered and lie to save himself? The court-martial transcript suggests the second possibility, because several soldiers testified that they had seen Michael and Thomas together frequently, that they had seemed close, that no one had noticed anything strange about their relationship until the day they were caught. One soldier testified, "Reed and Sullivan were always together. I assumed they were friends. I never saw Reed act like he was afraid of Sullivan." Another said, "The day after the arrest, Reed told me he had made a terrible mistake. I asked him what he meant. He would not say." But the court did not care about those details. The court cared that 2 men had been caught committing sodomy, and someone had to be punished. Michael Sullivan served 3 years in prison. He was released in 1867. There is no record of what happened to him after that. He does not appear in any census. He does not appear in any city directory. He vanished. Thomas Reed survived the war. He went home to Pennsylvania. He married in 1868. He had 4 children. He lived to the age of 63. His obituary made no mention of the war. This is the cost of survival in a world that criminalizes queer desire. Someone always pays, and it is almost never the person with the most power. Thomas Reed had the power to define the narrative. He said he was assaulted. The court believed him. Michael Sullivan, whether he was guilty or innocent, had no power at all. He was convicted. He was imprisoned. He was erased, and we will never know the truth. All we have is a court-martial transcript, 2 conflicting stories, and a man who disappeared from history. How many other men disappeared that way? How many were convicted of sodomy, real or fabricated? How many were sent to military prisons and forgotten? The records are incomplete, but we know there were others. We know because court-martial transcripts survive. Brief, clinical, devastating. Private John Doe, convicted of sodomy, sentenced to hard labor. Private Richard Rowe, convicted of attempted sodomy, dishonorably discharged. Names and sentences. That is all. No context, no details, just the record of a life destroyed. And these are only the men who were caught. How many others lived in fear of being caught? How many spent the entire war terrified that someone would notice, someone would suspect, someone would report them? George's diary from 1864 records a nightmare he had. He wrote, "I dreamed that someone discovered Jerome and me, that we were arrested and tried, that they sentenced us both to hang. I woke up gasping. Jerome was asleep beside me. I watched him breathe, and I felt such overwhelming terror that I almost woke him. But I did not. I just lay there, shaking, until dawn." That fear was real. It was constant. And for some men, it became reality. But here is what I want you to understand. Even in the face of that fear, even knowing the risks, queer soldiers still loved each other. They still found ways to be together. They still took the chance, because love is stronger than fear. It always has been. The war ended in April of 1865, but for the men who had loved each other during those 4 years, the real battle was just beginning, because the question they all faced was the same: what happens now? During the war, there had been a kind of permission. The closeness was necessary. The intimacy was survival. But in peacetime, those justifications disappeared. Men were expected to go home, to settle down, to marry, to become respectable citizens. There was no social role for two men who wanted to build a life together. No script, no map. Some men, like Jerome and George, found a way to write their own script. They moved west. They became business partners. They lived together for decades in plain sight, protected by the thin cover of economic necessity and the general assumption that two bachelors sharing a household was nothing more than practical. But they were rare, they were lucky, and they were careful. Most queer Civil War veterans were not so lucky. Most went home and married women. They had children they were supposed to want. They built lives that looked normal from the outside, and they carried their wartime loves as secret griefs, locked away in the back rooms of their hearts. There is a letter in the archives of the Wisconsin Historical Society, written in 1899 by a man named Edwin Barrett to his daughter. Edwin had served in the 6th Wisconsin Infantry, part of the famous Iron Brigade. He was 73 years old when he wrote the letter, and he was dying. The letter says, "There are things I need to tell you before I go, things I have never spoken of. During the war, I knew a man named Christopher. We were in the same company. We were very close, closer than I have been to anyone, before or since. I loved him in a way that I know you will not understand, in a way that the world says is wrong. But it was not wrong. It was the truest thing I have ever felt. Christopher died at Gettysburg. I have thought about him every day for 36 years. I married your mother because it was what I was supposed to do. I have tried to be a good husband and a good father. But there has always been a part of me that stayed on that battlefield with Christopher. I am telling you this because I do not want to die with it still secret. I do not expect you to approve. I just need you to know." His daughter burned the letter after she read it. We only know it existed because she mentioned it in her own diary years later. She wrote, "Father told me something terrible before he died. I cannot write what it was. I have burned his letter. I will never speak of it, but I cannot stop thinking about it. He seemed so sad." Edwin Barrett spent 36 years grieving a man he loved for maybe 2 years during the war. He built a whole life around that grief. He married, he had children, he did everything society expected. And he died, wanting his daughter to know that none of it had been quite real. How many other men lived that way? How many went to their graves carrying the names of men they had loved 50 years earlier? Men who had died in the war or lived on in other cities, unreachable and unforgettable. Thousands, tens of thousands, maybe more. And the cruelest part is that so many of them thought they were alone. They thought they were the only ones who felt that way. Because there was no community, no language, no way to find each other in the silence. But they were not alone. They were everywhere, in every town, in every regiment, in every graveyard where the veterans of the Civil War were buried. If you go to a Civil War cemetery today, and there are hundreds of them, scattered across the country, you will find rows and rows of identical headstones. Name, rank, regiment, that is all. The dead are lined up in perfect formation, as if they are still waiting for orders. But if you look closely, you start to notice patterns. Graves that are placed next to each other, closer than the regulation spacing. Headstones that match in style, even though they were erected decades apart. Inscriptions that reference friendship, companionship, devotion. There is a cemetery in Vermont where 2 veterans are buried side by side. Their headstones are identical. Both say, "Brothers in arms." But they were not brothers. They were not even related. They just served together. And someone, a family member, a friend, whoever paid for the headstones, decided that brothers in arms was the closest they could come to the truth. There is a cemetery in Georgia where a Confederate veteran is buried with an inscription that says, "Faithful to the end." Next to him is another grave, unmarked except for a small stone that says, "His companion." There is a cemetery in Illinois where 2 Union veterans share a single grave. The headstone says both their names, one above the other. Underneath it says, united in life, united in death. These graves are everywhere. Once you start looking for them, you cannot stop seeing them. And every one of them is a story we will never fully know. A love that had to hide. A bond that survived only in the careful wording of a headstone. But even in that careful wording, there is defiance. Because someone, the men themselves, or the people who loved them, insisted on marking the connection. They could have been buried separately. They could have had headstones that said nothing about each other. But instead, they found ways to be remembered together. Faithful companion, devoted friend, united in life. These are the words the 19th century allowed. So these are the words that were used. But we know what they really mean. We know because we are still here, because we recognize our own history when we see it. The Civil War was not a gay rights movement. It was not a moment of liberation. It was a war about slavery and union and the future of the country. But within that war, in the margins, in the spaces between the official history, queer people found each other, and some of them found love. They did not have the language to call it that. They did not have the political framework to defend it. They did not have a community to support them. But they loved anyway, and that love mattered. It mattered to the men who experienced it. It mattered to the veterans who spent the rest of their lives grieving it. And it matters to us now, because it is part of our history, part of the long, unbroken line of queer people who have always existed, who have always found ways to love, even in the least forgiving circumstances. The men who fought in the Civil War are all dead now. The last Union veteran died in 1956. The last Confederate veteran died in 1951. There is no one left who remembers the war firsthand. No one left who can tell us what it was really like. But their words survive, their diaries, their letters, their court-martial records and discharge papers and headstones. And if you read those words carefully, if you look past the official history and into the margins, you find us. You find Jerome, writing that he cannot imagine a life without George. You find George, writing that Jerome is the only warmth in a frozen world. You find Constant, writing that he would take a bullet for Orville. You find Orville, writing that he does not know how to keep living without Constant. You find Richard, writing that he is afflicted with a sickness that has no cure. You find Thomas Withers, telling Jerome about the man who kept him alive at Andersonville. You find Albert Cashier, insisting on being buried in his uniform. You find Newton Curtis wearing lace to war. You find Edwin Barrett, confessing to his daughter that the truest thing he ever felt was love for a man who died at Gettysburg. These men were real. Their love was real. And the fact that they had to hide it, the fact that they had to speak in code, the fact that most of them never got to live it fully, that does not make it less real. It makes it more precious, because they risked everything for it. Some of them lost everything. Some of them were court-martialed, imprisoned, erased. Some of them went home and spent 50 years pretending it had never happened. Some of them died on battlefields, holding the hands of men they loved but could never name. But some of them survived. Some of them found each other after the war and built quiet lives together. Some of them died old, in beds they shared, in houses they owned together, in cities far from the places they had been born. And all of them, the ones who survived and the ones who did not, the ones who got to keep their love and the ones who lost it, all of them are part of our history. Because queer history is not a story that starts with Stonewall. It is not a story that starts with the first Pride Parade or the first gay rights organization or the first time someone said the word homosexual out loud. It is a story that goes back as far as human history goes. It is a story that includes Roman emperors and Renaissance painters and Victorian poets. And yes, Union and Confederate soldiers who slept beside each other in canvas tents and called it friendship because they had no other word. The Civil War was one chapter in that story, a bloody, tragic, complicated chapter. But it was also a chapter where queer people found spaces to exist, even if those spaces were temporary and fragile and dependent on careful silence. And the fact that we can recover even fragments of that existence, the fact that Jerome and George's diaries survived, that court-martial transcripts were preserved, that someone thought to photograph two soldiers with their arms around each other, is a kind of miracle. Because most of queer history is lost. Most of it was never written down. Or it was written down and then destroyed. Or it was written in code that we can no longer crack. Or it existed only in moments, a touch, a look, a kiss in the dark, that left no record at all. But what we do have, we hold on to. We read those diaries. We study those photographs. We visit those graves. And we say, these were our people. This was our history. And we refuse to let it be forgotten. That is what tonight has been. An act of memory. An act of refusal. A refusal to let the men who loved each other during the Civil War stay buried in euphemism and silence. Jerome and George existed. They loved each other for more than 30 years. And when they died, they were buried side by side in a city far from the battlefields, under headstones that called them what the world would allow: beloved friend, faithful partner. But we know what they really were. We know because Jerome wrote it down. I love him. 3 words in a private diary that no one was supposed to read. But we read them, and we understand. Constant and Orville existed. They kept each other sane in the middle of a war. And when Constant died, Orville grieved him for the rest of his life and asked to be buried with Constant's diary, the only piece of him that remained. Richard and William existed, even though William never knew, even though Richard died before he could tell him. The love existed. It was real. Albert Cashier existed. He fought in 40 battles. He lived as a man for 53 years, and he asked to be buried in his uniform, as himself, no matter what the doctors said he was supposed to be. These men existed, and tonight we have kept them company. We have said their names. We have told their stories. We have refused to let them be forgotten. That is all history really is. That is all memory really is. Saying names out loud in quiet rooms. Keeping vigil for people who died alone. Making sure that someone, somewhere, remembers. And maybe that is all any of us can hope for. That when we are gone, someone will remember us accurately. Not the sanitized version. Not the version that makes other people comfortable. But the truth. The real, messy, complicated truth of who we were and who we loved. Jerome and George got that. They left diaries that told the truth. And 150 years later, we read those diaries and we know them. We know what they meant to each other. We know what they risked. We know what they built. Most people do not get that. Most people get an obituary that lists their respectable accomplishments and their surviving spouse and their children and leaves out everything that mattered. But not Jerome, not George, not the men we remembered tonight. They are remembered for what they really were. Soldiers, lovers, men who found each other in the chaos of the worst war America ever fought and held onto each other as tightly as they could for as long as they were allowed. And when the war ended and the world tried to pull them apart, some of them refused. They ran away to California. They opened bookshops. They lived above the shop and called each other partners and died old together, far from the battlefields. That is the story. That is the history. That is what we owe them, to tell it accurately, to say that they loved each other, not to hide it behind words like friendship or companionship, but to say it plainly. They loved each other, and their love mattered. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, think about them. Think about Jerome, sitting in a tent in Virginia, writing by candlelight that George is the best part of his life. Think about George, holding Jerome's hand in the dark and promising that they will never be separated. Think about Constant, dying in Orville's arms at Port Hudson. Think about Albert, insisting on his uniform. Think about all the men whose names we will never know, who loved and lost and survived and grieved and never got to say it out loud. Think about them. Because they had no one to think about them when they were alive. They were alone. They were silent. They were terrified of being discovered. But tonight, we are here. We know their names. We know their stories. And we refuse to let them be forgotten. That is the vigil. That is the act of memory. That is what it means to keep queer history alive. So as you fall asleep tonight, in your safe bed, in your safe world, where you are allowed to love who you love and call it by its real name, spare a thought for the men who were not so lucky, the men who had to hide, the men who had to use code, the men who died without ever telling anyone the truth. They existed, they loved, and they deserved better than history gave them. But at least tonight, they have us, keeping vigil, saying their names, refusing to let the silence win. If this story stayed with you, the like button helps the channel reach others who would love it too. May your dreams be free of battlefields, of hiding, of all the small violences that come from having to pretend you are someone you are not. Good night, and sleep well.